human beings are what we could refer to as cognitive misers, right? When given the opportunity to make a decision that doesn't expend a lot of cognitive energy versus one that's going to expend a lot of cognitive energy, we tend to go with the former rather than the latter. And so, the power of defaults have been shown to be one of the most powerful drivers of decision making and behavior change across a variety of fields, particularly in finance. In the financial field, defaults have been incredibly powerful. So I'll give you a quick non-financial example and then a financial one. The non-financial one was, they might have seen, you might have come across this fascinating chart, which is showing rates of organ donation across different countries.
Right.
And
this is the Future Ready Advisor, a show about transforming your financial advisory practice. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan, a wealth management consultant, behavioral scientist, and keynote speaker. In this podcast, I dive deep into the real challenges advisors face and bring you insightful conversations with top industry experts. Together, we'll explore practical strategies grounded in behavioral science to help you better serve your clients, optimize your time, and build a future-ready practice. I'm Sam Sivarajan, and welcome to the Future Ready Advisor. Today, I'm joined by JonRobert Tat Tartaglione, a behavioral scientist and founder of Influence 51, a consulting firm that bridges the gap between cutting-edge academic research and real-world applications. With a doctorate in psychology from Cambridge and expertise spanning decision-making, behavior change, and strategic communication, Tat specializes in translating complex psychological insights into practical tools that leaders can use immediately. As co-author of the award-winning book, Our Search for Belonging, he understands what truly drives human behavior, knowledge that's essential for financial advisors who need to influence client decisions and inspire lasting behavioral change. Get ready for a conversation that will transform how you think about client engagement and the psychology behind every financial decision. Tat, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam. I'm really excited to have the conversation today.
I am as well. I think I enjoyed our pre-recording conversation, and I'm sure the audience will love this conversation. So, Tat, your journey from studying human nature in academia to founding Influence 51 is very interesting. Can you share what sparked your realization that there was this gap between psychological research and its practical application, particularly for financial advisors and other professionals who work with human behavior every day?
Yeah, absolutely. So that really was the entire impetus behind Influence 51 is, I had been studying human behavior for a few years at that point at the graduate level. And I found it fascinating, right? I'm a bit biased, but I found it absolutely fascinating. These things that drive our decision making, that make us tick. And I was curious whether other individuals were aware of these things that I was learning at the time, and B, whether there was going to be kind of value additions if I were to be able to bring these into other domains. And so actually, prior to starting Influence 51, what I ended up doing is I ended up reaching out to my friends who were in different industries, and I kind of would ask them probing questions. Like, for instance, I reached out to friends that were just in the general kind of corporate space where they were starting to become people managers. And I said, hey, did they ever teach you about the psychology of motivation or the psychology of building effective incentive systems? And they're like, well, no, it's kind of something you learn on the job. We don't really do formal training and anything like that. And, I went to my friends who were in the political space and I said, hey, do they teach you about things like message framing, right? Like the psychology or voter behavioral science around voter turnout, how you can maximize voter and they were like, no, it's more of something that we kind of learn as trial and error. Like there's been good campaigns and bad campaigns, but they weren't really systemizing it, right? They weren't really kind of creating these formulas or using these insights that we had in academia. And it's the same thing with financial advisors. For me, with financial professionals, many of them are probably aware at least about, psychological phenomena like loss aversion or default biases or commitment devices or choice architecture. But some of them either aren't familiar enough to really be comfortable applying them in their day-to-day work. And some of them just genuinely have never heard of it. When I talk to some people about their default options they're using, well, they say, well, whatever kind of is given to me, I give to the clients. And that's certainly one way to go about it. But for me, I'm like, hey, listen, we have this compendium of literature in psychology and behavioral science about how people make decisions, and more specifically, about how you can influence those decisions based on the way you do things like curate choice environments, like craft the way questions are framed or messages are worded. Why not use those things to be better at what you do?
I think that's brilliant. It's to me, when you're talking, it's the analogy between knowing the theory between how an internal combustion engine works and having a car that you can put your key into and I'm dating myself and you can start it, right? And I think that's the point that you're making. There's a lot of advancements in behavioral science. So that's
Mm,
the equivalent of learning some of the theory behind how an internal combustion engine works. But to be able to drive a car, you don't really need to know all of that. You need to know that you can put it into, you can start the car and get to where you want to go. And I think the challenge of behavioral science has always been, how do you put this into practical application? It's
yes.
one thing to know that a person can have an overconfidence bias or have a tendency to have external locus of control or what have you. But how do you translate that into insight that a financial advisor can bring to the table and then help the client modify their behavior accordingly?
Yeah, that's
And
exactly right.
so I think when you talk and identify yourself as a translator of academic research, I think that resonates with me. And so when financial advisors hear terms like loss aversion or choice architecture, as you mentioned, they might think they understand them. But I guess how do you translate? How do you help people truly experience and internalize these concepts so that they can apply them practically with their clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I think that is where my value ultimately lies. Right? Is there are people out there. There are plenty of people out there who are smarter than I am. I met a lot of them at Cambridge. Right? There are brilliant, brilliant people out there. The challenge becomes, how valuable is all of that knowledge if you can't disseminate it in a way that makes sense to people, that is palatable, that is digestible, and ultimately is applicable. And that's really where I find my strength is I have been really good with my clients at being able to take these kind of messy, complicated concepts in psychology and behavioral science and put them into terms that they say, okay, that makes sense, right? I get that. And not only do I get it, but now I understand how I can use that to be better at what I do. And so I think translator is an apt descriptor of how, what I consider myself to be in this space. Um, and I'll give you an example. You mentioned loss aversion and choice architecture. We'll come back to loss aversion. I would like to, if you don't mind, we can return
Mhm.
to how I help people get a better understanding of loss aversion. But I'll use choice architecture as an example. Choice architecture is this concept wherein, a lot of individuals, I'll take it all the way back just in case individuals who are listening aren't familiar at all, right?
Mhm.
A lot of people operate on the assumption that our preferences for different choices are static, right? I'm going to choose, if I prefer A over B, it doesn't really matter how you present A and B. It doesn't matter what you juxtapose A and B with. It doesn't matter what time you're presenting A and B, right? A preference is a preference is a preference. And that's kind of this traditional wisdom that individuals have, which choice architecture, time and time again, shows not to be the case. And so choice architecture is really about showing how you can alter individuals' preferences and you can alter their decision making and their behavior simply by changing the environment in which these choices are presented, right? And so to give a real world example, it would be something like if you were to go into a cafeteria and you prefer cookies over salad, right? Given the choice between cookies and salad, it's cookies all day long. But if you were to go into a cafeteria where they made it so the cookies were harder to get to, the salad was really easily accessible, where they presented information about the dangers of high sugar and they presented information about the benefits of healthy eating, right? Curate an environment where you're presented with information that can alter the way you look at certain choices, but also can make making certain choices easier or harder. You can change the way people behave. And so, to give just a quick example, if you were to take something like message framing, right? We'll stick with the food example. If you were to go to a grocery store and you were interested in something like frozen yogurt, I could give you some frozen yogurt and I could say, hey, this one's 80% fat free. Or I could give you frozen yogurt and say, hey, this one's 20% fat. Now, you can't help feeling differently about those things, but we're smart people and we quickly realize those are the same exact yogurts, right? Something that's 80% fat free and 20% fat are exactly the same, but this is the power of things like framing effects, right? Presenting the same information, but emphasizing different aspects of it and thereby eliciting different reactions from individuals.
No, I've always found that research fascinating. Now, let's bring this to the realm of financial advisors.
Hmm.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been research that has shown, for example, that presenting things in absolute terms versus in percentage terms is an example of that choice architecture or framing effect that you talk about. Can you talk to that a little bit from the financial advisor perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. You can do absolute terms or relative terms, or we could even do something like the way which you present numeric numbers in general. So you can take something like frequencies versus probabilities. Human beings have evolved in a particular way. And if you kind of trace the course of human evolution, you find that humans tend to be more sensitive to frequencies, to whole numbers, right? And so what we find, for instance, if you're talking about financial advisors, there is a big difference between saying you have a 10% chance of losing money on it. Let's say you're trying to dissuade a client from making too aggressive of a financial maneuver, right?
Right.
On the one hand, you could say, hey, listen, you have a 10% chance of losing money on this, right? That's probability framing.
Mhm.
That tends to be somewhat less effective. Probability framing from a psychological potency standpoint isn't the most effective. Whereas frequency framing, what you could say is that, hey, listen, every 100 times you make this decision, 10 of those times you're losing all your money, right? Now, these are statistically identical. 10% and 10 out of 100 are exactly the same. But what happens with frequencies is frequencies are often much easier to visualize,
Right.
right? It's much easier to visualize these 10 occasions where I'm losing all of my money on this investment as opposed to the more abstract 10% number, right? It doesn't really have that type of concretization of like what's going to happen to me. And so again, framing is if I had to pick like an area of expertise that I'm most passionate about, it is framing, and I'm sure I'll talk about it some other time during this call. But there are many, many ways in which you can present the same exact number, the same exact data. And ultimately, when I work with financial advisors, that in and of itself is a really important realization. It's a really important to understand that every time you're putting together something for a client, you should be taking some time to stop, take a step back and say, hey, listen, I have this figure on page 2 of this prospectus. What are the other ways I can present this figure? What are the other ways I can frame it? What are the other examples I can give? Because if humans were perfectly rational decision makers, it wouldn't matter whether it was frequencies or probabilities,
Right.
relative versus absolute, but we're not. We're influenced by these small alterations.
So I think this is fascinating, and I'm going to ask you a controversial question. So let's go back to the supermarket example. So a very real example is, so for example, when supermarkets lay out their stores, things like fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, etc., milk and eggs, the staples are always in the farthest corner of the supermarket. So you have to go through aisles and aisles of, let's call it, the processed foods, the cookies,
Yeah.
the chips, the pop, all of those things, etc. And in reality, everyone always has a choice, right? Nobody is stopped. Nobody's forcing somebody to load their cart full of chips and cookies, etc. But everything that you've said about choice architecture means that there is the way that they are capitalizing on the way human beings' brains are wired, etc.
That's correct.
This is what Richard Thaler in his book Nudge would call a nudge, right?
Mhm.
And I think that he himself has addressed the fact that there's obviously one way of thinking that says that this is wrong, that this is paternalistic, that this is, pushing people to do certain things, etc. So in a financial advisor world, I think this is something that nudging behavior to get them to the best possible outcome is obviously desirable from a client objective point of view, but it can also veer into this realm of being paternalistic or removing, I guess, some element of choice from the end client, etc. How would you address that kind of conundrum, if you will?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great question. And what we're getting into here, right, is we're getting into this more philosophical idea of like, what is too paternalistic, or even more specifically, what does it mean to influence an individual when it comes to their choice or their autonomy, right? Because on the one hand, the whole idea behind something like nudging and what Thaler and Sunstein have referred to as libertarian paternalism, right? Their big idea was there needs to be a way to change human behavior beyond the classic economic levers, right? Beyond things like taxation or less, less money, right? Beyond these economic levers, there are ways to do this. And their idea was this idea of libertarian paternalism, nudging, being able to basically present everyone, you're not taking away any options, but you're trying to make certain options look more appealing. Now, proponents of nudging would say exactly this. They would say, hey, listen, they are not violating your autonomy, your ability to choose as you wish. And so you still have kind of full freedom of choice. Although they might be trying to make one option look better than another one, you still are able to make whatever choice you want and pick the less appealing option if you'd like. And so they would say that they're not violating your autonomy. The opponents of nudging are going to say, hey, listen, anyone who is trying to influence someone in one way or another is implicitly violating their autonomy. So they might hold a stricter view of autonomy as being something that needs to be completely unfettered, unobstructed in any way possible, right? And so it really comes down to these conflicting definitions of what do we mean by preserving someone's autonomy? Is it just that they still have the ability to make all these choices? Or is it that they can make any choice they want without anyone trying to influence them in any way whatsoever? Now, what I think people like Thaler would say, and people like myself, quite frankly, would say in a lot of ways, is it is hard to, and some people would argue it's impossible to present a neutral framing of something.
Mm-hmm.
And what we mean by that is if I were to say, hey, there's three options here, I'm just going to give you all three and let you make your choice. Guess what? You're still going to be influenced by which option comes first versus which comes last, right? There are things like order effects that are going to impact your decision making. And so me giving it to you in this kind of unbiased way is still going to make an impact. And so they argue that, hey, listen, if people are going to be impacted by this choice architecture in one way or another, why don't we be deliberate about it? Why don't we try to make these things enable people to make better choices? Now, again, the question becomes better for whom, right? And we do get into a dangerous area there where, if the financial advisor, let's say, if their incentives are not aligned with the incentives of their client, then them nudging can become unethical. But assuming that their needs and their desires, their goals are aligned, then it's in both of their best interests for that financial advisor to say, hey, listen, I want to try to structure this in the most advantageous way for my client, because ultimately my client doing well is me doing well.
That's a great explanation, Tat.
Thanks.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I think you're absolutely right. This is assuming the opponents are assuming that this all exists in a vacuum, right? Where such a thing as neutral as possible. As long as human beings are involved in the other side of the equation, there is no such thing as neutral. I think you can try to remove as much as you want as some of the bias and et cetera, but just instinctively and intuitively, choice making is some degree of preference that you have to put in. And I think you're right. It fundamentally comes down to any tool, whether it's dynamite, as they say, or behavioral change. If it's used in the wrong way, it is going to be giving you wrong results or bad results. And I think behavioral framing behavioral choice architecture, I think it depends very much on how the user intends to use it. If it is for mutual benefit, then it's one thing. If it is for sole benefit at the detriment of the end client, there's not really much that you can do to avoid that, because that motivation is always going to be there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, what I'll say is a hammer in the hands of someone is a tool, and the hands of someone else is a weapon. And so, unfortunately, the best thing you can do is hope that a bunch of people are going to use it as tools, and those that are trying to use it as weapons, the best defense you have is understanding how they're trying to use it.
And being aware of these tendencies of human behavior, how behavioral finance, how our wiring works. So your work focuses on three key areas: strategic communication, influencing decision-making, and behavior change. Let's dive into decision-making first. You mentioned that people don't make decisions in vacuums, but that we can actually influence shift preferences through choice architecture. So you've given us an example of this already in real-world terms. Can you walk us through another practical example? Because I think this is very important for our audience, how an advisor might restructure a client conversation to influence better financial decisions for their benefit, for the client's benefit.
Yeah, I think that there's a few options we could talk about here. I'll touch upon three really quickly. How about that? Because I think these are three good ones. The first one is understanding the power of defaults. Human beings are what we could refer to as cognitive misers, right? When given the opportunity to make a decision that doesn't expend a lot of cognitive energy versus one that's going to expend a lot of cognitive energy, we tend to go with the former rather than the latter. And so, the power of defaults have been shown to be one of the most powerful drivers of decision making and behavior change across a variety of fields, particularly in finance. In the financial field, defaults have been incredibly powerful. So I'll give you a quick non-financial example and then a financial one. The non-financial one was, they might have seen, you might have come across this fascinating chart, which is showing rates of organ donation across different countries.
Right.
And, on the left-hand side, there's 4 countries where the levels are below 10%.
Right.
And on the right-hand side, there's like 6 or 7 countries where the levels are above 90%. And it's funny, when you ask people to explain, why is there such a disparity, they tend to try to turn to like dispositional explanations of the different countries and different cultures. Like, oh, maybe the French are really stingy, or maybe, the Dutch are really generous. But ultimately, this entire thing comes down to, what was the default in that country? Was it an opt-in donation form or opt-out donation form? And it's important to start off with this, because this might be one of the most consequential choices an individual ever makes, whether to donate their organs or not. And the vast majority of decisions are being driven by whether a form comes pre-ticked or not on the form you receive, right? And so that's the power of defaults. And so for financial advisors, one of the things we found is you want to automate, you want to make the right financial maneuvers either be the default, be presented as the default, that this is what most people tend to do, or to be automated in some way, right? To reduce that friction. And so defaults are incredibly powerful. It's shown of the ability to help people increase saving, increase retirements, things like that, by making this the default. The other power in defaults, just really quick, is that they tend to signify that this is what most people are doing. And that gets to this notion of what we call social proof, right? There's safety in knowing that other people are doing this as well. And so defaults would be number one. The second thing is to understand what we call the paradox of choice. Barry Schwartz is really the individual who really popularized this, but a lot of people operate under this assumption that there's this linear relationship, this linear positive relationship between choice and happiness, that the more choices, the more options we give people, the happier they become. But we actually find that it doesn't quite operate like that. Eventually, you get a point where adding more choices starts to decrease individuals' levels of happiness. And not only does it decrease levels of happiness, but it decreases levels of engagement. And there was actually one of the largest studies on this was looking into 401k contributions. And they found that individuals, when presented with like 3 or 4 fund options for their 401ks, became much more likely to actually invest than individuals who were presented with dozens and dozens. And this is what we call analysis paralysis.
Right.
Sometimes as humans, being presented with so many options, although hypothetically you could optimize your choices, from a practical standpoint, it gets people to recoil, to just say, hey, listen, I'm overwhelmed. And rather than make any choice, I'm going to make no choice at all. And I'm just not going to save. And so the paradox of choice is really important to understand, because what this means for financial advisors is people are going to be not only able to make better decisions, but able to make any decisions whatsoever if you can create a curated list of 3 to 4 good options for them, as opposed to saying, hey, here are 2 dozen that we could choose from. Which one do you like best? And so paradox of choice would be another one. And the third one would be, I don't want to use this term, but I'm going to use the term because it's a little provocative, but it doesn't have to be provocative in the way I say, but there's something called decoy options. So the classic example of decoy options, again, people might have come upon it, is with the Economist back a few decades ago. Ariely is the one who popularized this. They gave people 3 options for subscriptions, okay? There was an online-only option for like $60, a print-only option for $120, print and online bundle for $125. And when you ask people which one they prefer, and they ask students at MIT Sloan School of Management, some of the most brilliant business minds in the world, which would they prefer, the vast majority preferred the bundle. And it makes sense, because when you look and you say, hey, I can get a bundle, I can get print and online for the same price as print, it seems like a misprint. It seems like a mistake.
Right.
So people feel like they're taking advantage. But in reality, what they do is they say, okay, now we're going to provide you with just 2 options. We're going to take out the print-only option. Do you want the online only for 60 or the printed online bundle for 125? And here you get what's called a preference reversal, right? Now the majority want the online only. And that's because the print only option is what we call a decoy option. It's not designed to sell. It's designed to make other things look better by comparison. And so again, when we talk about things like choice architecture, sometimes it's about creating these things that are not designed for, let's say, a financial client to choose, but rather to guide them to make other things look more appealing. So to give you a concrete example of what that could look like, let's say consumers are like Goldilocks. This is what I'll tell a lot of people. Consumers tend to be like Goldilocks, where they tend to veer away from the extremes and try to find a nice point in the middle. And so if you were to go to a nice restaurant, you have a $20 bottle, a $50 bottle, and a $100 bottle of wine, you ask them, which one you want. Most people are going to go with the $50 bottle,
Right,
because it represents this nice trade-off. And so when I work with restaurant clients and they say, how do we sell more of the $100 bottle? It's pretty simple. You put a $200 bottle on the menu and it makes the $100 bottle look better by comparison.
right.
For financial clients, what that looks like, if you're giving them a conservative portfolio, a moderate portfolio, and an aggressive portfolio, chances are most people are going to go with the moderate. But if you find that too many people are going with the aggressive, what you ultimately want to do is you want to create a very conservative portfolio, okay? Because now the conservative portfolio looks slightly more aggressive by comparison, and the moderate portfolio looks slightly more aggressive by comparison. So you might be able to satiate their need for a little bit more of aggressive financial maneuvers by making it seem like these 2 are more aggressive by comparison than this very conservative portfolio.
That's great, Tat. Those are great, relevant examples for advisors. Now let's move to behavior change. And because this is perhaps the biggest challenge financial advisors face, because let's be clear, I think in most conversations that financial advisors have with their clients, they're agreed on their intention, right? Both want to save more, both want to say that, yes, we know the markets go up and down, we're going to invest for the long term, and so on and so on and so on. But where the problem is that there is a difference between intention and action when the moment comes. And so a client might intellectually understand that they need to save more for retirement or stick to their investment plan. But in the heat of the moment, when the markets are dropping 20% or whatever, the advisor isn't there as the angel on their shoulder.
Mhm.
So how can advisors create systems or frameworks that can influence their clients' behavior even when they're not physically present?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really hard question, right? So I want to preface this by saying, some colleagues in this space, I think, overstate what they can do sometimes. And I want to be clear that, ultimately what I'm able to do is I'm able to increase your chance of success by a few percentage points here and there. And financial advisors understand the value of that, right? Because they're working with percentages all the time.
Right.
But behavior change is really, really complicated. It's hard. It's one of the hardest things that we can do. But we do have certain tools we've developed in behavioral science that can make it more likely that individuals stick to these things. And so the first one is something you're touching upon. We actually call it implementation intentions. Now, ultimately, what this boils down to is creating scenarios that are kind of if-then scenarios, right? So we're saying if the market drops 10%, I will stay invested. If the market drops 10%, I will, buy, 5% more ultimately than I have right now. But the important thing about implementation intentions is, one, you need to make sure that individuals are doing them, kind of with a clear mind. But number two, you need to make sure that it feels like it's them who are creating these. There is a phenomenon in psychology. Before I get into the phenomenon, I'll let you experience it for a moment, right? You go to an art museum. You're admiring. You're alone in a room. You're admiring a statue. Next to the statue, you see a sign that says, "Do not touch the art." What's the first thing you want to do?
Touch it.
You want to touch the art. Everyone wants to touch the art. It's the strangest phenomenon. It's actually a phenomenon that psychologists have studied. It's called psychological reactance. So it basically, when humans feel that their autonomy is being constrained, that their kind of freedom to do and choose as they wish is being compromised, we instinctively kind of push back, right? You tell me, do not touch the art. I say, I'm going to touch the art if I want to touch the art. Psychological reactance is really important when it comes to persuasion, because a lot of people think that persuasion is like a battle of arguments, that like I can overpower your argument with my argument. And if I give you the right facts and data, you're going to have to concede.
Right.
But really what ends up happening is persuasion is very much about approach more than anything. And so with psychological reactance, I bring that up because a lot of times if you create if-then statements, for instance, and in the heat of the moment, someone can turn and say, hey, listen, you were the one who told me to do this, not me. This wasn't my idea, right? You get that psychological reactance. Whereas if you can kind of make clear that, hey, listen, you are building these, not me. These are your statements, not mine. In the heat of the moment, when it comes down to it, you're less likely to get that pushback, that reaction. This was you, not me. This was you who made this when you were thinking clearly. And so you want them to give that opportunity to really reflect on like, this was your own choice. That's really, really critical. The other thing that you want to do is you want to create what are called commitment devices. So these are, the best way I can describe commitment devices is that there are certain things that, you know that you're not going to have a lot of power over, right? Classic example is Ulysses when he's going past the sirens and he says, tie me to the mast because I know I'm not going to be able to resist those sirens. And so creating these commitment devices are basically these devices that kind of tie us to something metaphorically rather than literally in moments where we know there's going to be high stress or we're not really going to be able to handle these things. And so an example of a commitment device, because I know financial advisors can't, tie someone down and say, do not sell, right? But an example would be creating friction at times when you're most likely to make volatile emotional decisions. And so maybe later on in the conversation, we can get into fast brain versus slow brain, but to, suffice it to say, there are moments when your fast brain, this emotional part of your brain, wants to take over the decision-making process. These are the moments where you create a commitment device that says something along the lines of, before we make any decisions, we have to have a 15-minute conversation about what your plan was. We have to review what you said, and we have to talk through how this is going to impact your future self. So you give them an opportunity to talk themselves back into sanity, talk themselves out of it. And this commitment device kind of creates this space where they need to have that cool off period before they make any decisions.
It is very powerful. Let me just dive into that a bit. I mean, your implementation intentions, this is Peter Gollwitzer's
That's right.
research, etc. But I think it's a critical point that you make. Like in many cases, financial advisors will walk through with clients scenarios. So that's the if component of the if-then element. What you're talking about, and what Gollwitzer talks about, is the very powerful second half of that is, what will you, client, do if this happens? Yes, we say that the markets have a tendency of going down at points. Okay, what will you do at that point? How are you feeling? What are you thinking? What is your reaction? And we can get into hot versus cold states, but that's perhaps at a later time. And I think your commitment device example is a great one. I think it is again an extension of that if then to say, okay, that for instance, and I'll give another example, which I'm sure you're aware of, for somebody that has a tendency to spend too much money, for example, an impulse purchase. One sort of urban legend of what people might do is they can put their credit card in the freezer, et cetera, and have it freeze over, right? So,
Yeah.
in order for you to use it, because you suddenly want to buy something, you have to take it out of the freezer and allow it to thaw before you can do it. So that's that moment where the hour or two that you can allow between the impulse and your reaction that allows you to have that slow down a little bit and think about, is this within the budget or not? I think your point is very valid that the financial advisors, I think the key of what you're talking about is these kind of conversations and these kind of interactions have to occur with the client before these kind of situations occur. So at the outset, when you're setting your a portfolio strategy, for example, the client or the advisor needs to have these kind of implementation and intention discussions and commitment discussions, because at that point, they're not in this hot state where they're emotional, where they're reacting to what's happening in the market. They can coldly and rationally sit there and say, okay, this is what I know I should do. This is what I want to do. So that when the time comes that down the road, 6 months, 6 years later, that they're tempted to do this, they already have a foundation in place that the advisor can go to, say, remember, you said that you wanted to do this, etc. This deals with your psychological reactance point, but I think and I think you had it 100% right at the beginning. None of this is a guarantee. Behavior
Yeah.
change is important. We are very, very complicated individuals across the world, and all you can do is try to kind of tilt the odds in your favor. And the recommendations that you're making, Tat, are very much in that.
Thank you, Sam.
So if we move on, your book, Our Search for Belonging, explores the fundamental human need to connect, but that fundamental need can actually end up dividing us. Can you explain that concept and how advisors can use this understanding or this definition of belonging to build stronger client relationships and help clients make decisions that align with their values rather than just following the latest fad or influencers' recommendations?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the book, which I co-authored with Howard Ross, who's excellent, was really about this idea that a lot of individuals don't understand how powerful our social nature really is, how strong our desire to belong, to fit in is. I'll give you just a quick taste of what that looks like from a psychological standpoint. There was this paradigm developed by Kipling Williams and Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman called cyberball. Okay. And basically what it was is they would put people into an fMRI machine and they would put a screen in front of them and they would say, hey, you have an avatar right here that you're controlling. There's two other avatars on this screen that are being controlled by other players. You're going to pass the ball around to each other. You're just going to have a game of catch. And so they would start passing the ball around to one another. And then all of a sudden, after about 30 seconds of sharing the ball amicably, the other two players start just passing the ball back and forth to themselves, to each other, and they exclude you. So for the last 30 seconds of this game, you're left sitting there feeling socially rejected, socially excluded. Now, unbeknownst to you, these aren't two players who are sitting in two different rooms. They're a computer program, and it's designed to exclude you because the researchers wanted to see what happens at the level of the brain when we experience social rejection. What they found, which is one of the most profound findings in the past few decades of neuroscience, they found that the areas of the brain that light up when we experience social rejection, even in a silly ball tossing game like this, overlap significantly with the areas of the brain that are activated when we experience physical pain. At the level of the brain, being socially rejected is processed in the same way as physical pain is processed.
Wow.
And I don't have time to get into it, but there's an evolutionary reason for that, which is basically if you were excluded from the group, if we go back 10,000 years into our evolutionary past, you were likely to die.
Right.
You were likely to not be able to survive. And so social rejection was a threat to our survival. And so we've evolved to process social rejection like that. Point is, human beings are deeply social creatures. And that does impact the way we do things like make financial decisions, because ultimately we want to see in a certain light. We want to see ourselves as members of a certain group.
Mhm.
And you can leverage this as a financial advisor. One of my favorite things to do when it comes to talking to financial advisors about this is I like to say, when you sit them down, instead of kind of walking them through just more vanilla, like here are different plans we can use, talk to them about different groups of investors, different investing styles, right? Hey, you have on the one hand, you have maybe kind of the Buffett Graham value group. Like, here's what these investors do. You have the bottlehead group, the kind of market efficiency bottle. This is what these investors do. This is their investment philosophy. But you create social groups and you say, how do you see yourself, right? What group do you want to be a part of? And this kind of gives them an opportunity to not only say, I'm investing, right? But that I'm this type of investor. This is the investment group I find myself in. And there's benefit in that, right? Because if they decide that they're more of a Buffett type, investor, it's really, really nice to be able to create that narrative that when the market drops,
What would
right?
Buffett do?
Exactly. People like Buffett do this, right? If you want to be this type of advisor, if you want to see their type of results, you have to stick with what the group does in situations like this. And there's safety in that group and knowing that this is how other people are behaving at that time as well. The other tip I would give when I work with financial advisors is that there's this paradox with people where people want to conform to the group. There's a drive to conform to the group because there's safety in doing what everyone else is doing. But we don't want to be fully cloned, right? We want to keep a little bit of distinctiveness of us. And psychologists refer to this as optimal distinctiveness theory. Doing what most people are doing, but maybe doing it slightly different so you can maintain a little bit of that unique identity. Apple was great at this when they first launched their iPods, right? Apple realized that, hey, everyone wanted an iPod, but people didn't want to feel like they were just like everyone else. And so what do? They introduced colors. So now, yes, I'm doing what everyone's doing and I'm buying an iPod, but I have a green iPod, or I have a pink iPod. And that was a perfect example of optimal distinctiveness theory because people could still do what everyone was doing, but they didn't feel like they were just a sheep, right? They still felt like they had that unique identity. And so with financial advisors, what that looks like is saying, hey, we have conservative portfolios, moderate portfolios, aggressive portfolios. You let them pick kind of one of the core things that represents 95% of their overall strategy. And then you say, but hey, listen, right? We can do a small cap value tilt. We can do kind of a large cap tilt. We can do a growth at a reasonable price tilt. Let's find a way to make this unique to you. That other 5% of your portfolio is just yours. And that gives them the opportunity to say, hey, listen, yeah, I'm doing a moderate portfolio allocation like, 90% of other people are doing, but I have a small cap value tilt in mind, right? Or I have an emerging markets tilt in mind. And so it gives them that ability to maintain the uniqueness of their identity as an investor. And they're not just kind of doing what everyone else is doing.
That's great, Todd. And you just underscore an important point. Again, this is not anything. This is where behavioral finance has become very powerful in the world of financial advice. It's a recognition that this has nothing to do with rationality or irrationality. It is that human beings bring multiple lenses to situations. And this one that you talk about, social identity, is very, very critical. And I think advisors that can be aware of that and leverage it in the positive way can help both their clients and themselves achieve the shared objectives, right, in a better way. Now, before we wrap up, maybe one final question. So looking ahead, we see AI and robo-advisors becoming more prevalent. I happen to believe, and think that you would agree that the human element of financial advice becomes even more critical. It is that distinctiveness, the optimal distinctiveness that you're talking about. How do you see the principles of behavioral science and influence becoming a source of competitive advantage for advisors who want to continue to remain relevant and valuable to their clients?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And ultimately, I think that when people work with advisors, they're not just looking for data of what they should be doing. They can get that online, right? They can get that going, and doing a search.
Right.
They want someone they can trust. They want someone who can guide them. They want someone who can talk sense to them when maybe they feel they're doing something irrational, right? And I think that ultimately it's about leaning in to the more human aspects of what people want in an advisor, but also what they need in financial advice. Human beings, as we've discussed at length, you know, one of the best ways I can describe humans is humans are not rational creatures. They're rationalizing creatures. And there's
Oh,
a
that's good.
really important difference there, right? Rational creatures, they go about, taking every piece of evidence like a scientist would. They evaluate it objectively and impartially, and whatever comes out as right or truth, they go with it. No questions asked. Human brains are much more like a trial lawyer, right? Where you have a certain thing that you want to defend, a certain worldview, a certain idea, a certain investment, that you are really attached to. And you go about preferentially kind of seeking out, data that allows you to feel good about that, to confirm your biases. And I think really what a great advisor can do is they can understand these quirks, these cognitive quirks, these nuances of humans. They can help them get a better understanding of themselves. Here is why you feel this way, when it comes to market dropping because of loss aversion. Here is why you do this because of something called confirmation bias. And not to make them feel guilty or feel subpar compared to these kind of idealistic utility maximizers that people think they should be, but to explain that here are the pitfalls of human psychology, and here's how we overcome them to get you where you want to be. Ultimately, to have an advisor that not only understands the numbers well, but also understands me as a human being, there's a great deal of trust and comfort in knowing that person has my back.
That's great. I couldn't agree with you more. You're absolutely right. Information is ubiquitous today, especially in the world of ChatGPT and Google search and everything else. I think the information overload is such that there's conflicting information out there. And what a client needs is somebody that they trust to help them navigate to say what is optimal for me and for my situation. And everything that you've said, I think this is where an advisor can play a real role to sit there and say, help them be that coach, navigate this field of overwhelming information to say what is relevant, what is signal, and what is noise, and focus accordingly. Tat, we're coming to the end of our podcast. So I have a couple of rapid fire questions for you that I ask all of my guests. So if you're ready.
Okay.
So number one, professionally, what is the most important lesson you've learned over the years?
For me in particular is to what I do doesn't sell in the abstract, right? Like, I used to, when I first started, I had a frustrating, few years really where I tried to say, I help clients leverage insights from psychology and behavioral science to be more effective. That's so abstract. It's so hard to grasp. People don't really understand it. And it wasn't until I started going to specific clients, right? Like financial advisors saying, hey, listen, let me talk to you about commitment devices. Let me talk to you about loss aversion. Let me talk to you about choice architecture and how you can use these things. And once I explain them to people, they immediately see the value. It's just about making it concrete and applicable for their world.
Right.
And so for me, as someone who operates in multiple domains, on any one day, I can be working with corporate leaders and then working with political strategists and then working with financial advisors and lawyers. It's about really making sure that I'm targeting the application of this to what matters to them. And so for me, that was a big, big learning lesson for me.
That's a great lesson.
Yeah.
Talk the language. It's not about what do you do. It's why should I care, right? Why does this matter to me? And what you're talking about is, I think, what financial advisors and all of us live through every day. It's not enough to have the solutions. You have to be able to say to the client, to explain why that solution solves a problem that they want to solve at this stage.
Yes.
Number two, what is one practical tip you would offer listeners keen on applying your insights?
Have a tip. Can it be slightly longer, maybe 2
Sure,
minutes?
please.
Okay. So the tip is language matters. Language matters so much. There is a difference between saying, like I said, between 80% fat-free and 20% fat. There's a difference between something having a 90% chance of success and a 10% chance of failure. There's a difference between 10% and 10 out of 100. These are all statistically identical. And so financial professionals look at these things and say, does it really matter how I present these are the same thing? But it does. Even seemingly insignificant tweaks matter. And I'll give two quick examples. The first one is something like as simple as a fundraiser. Chances are you've never thought whether it matters to talk about it as an annual fundraiser or a once a year fundraiser.
Mm-hmm.
Research shows it does. Although those are exactly the same thing, people tend to donate more when it's framed as a once a year fundraiser as opposed to an annual, because an annual gets people to emphasize that, hey, this is something that happened last year, happened this year, it's going to happen next year. It reduces urgency. Whereas once a year, although it's exactly the same, gets people to focus on the fact this is my one time to make an impact, right? So seemingly insignificant shifts matter, but being more deliberate about our language kind of puts the power in our hands. So my favorite example is the metaphors we use. Metaphors saturate our conversations. We use them all the time. If you say someone's warm-hearted or cold-hearted, you're using a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
To give you another example, I just said metaphors saturate our conversations. That was a metaphor, right? We're using them constantly, but there's research to show that if you use them deliberately, you can change the way people think about things and ultimately the way they seek to solve problems. So my favorite example, back in 2011, Thibodeau and E.D.G.E did this thing where they gave people a vignette about crime. Half the people read that crime was a beast attacking our city. The other half read, crime is a virus infecting our city. And they asked both groups the same question. What do we do about crime? Well, the first group was given the beast metaphor, naturally asked themselves, what would I do about a beast? I want to cage it, I want to capture it, I want to punish it. And the second group intuitively asked themselves, what should we do about crime? What would I do about a virus, right? I want to stop it from infecting people. I want to inoculate it. And when they asked these groups, what should we do about crime, they found that the ones that received the beast metaphor became more likely to recommend enforcement strategies. We need more police on the streets. We need harsher penalties for criminals. Those who received the virus metaphor became more likely to recommend social reform strategies. We need to change whatever is causing crime or causing people to turn to crime in our neighborhoods. The point being is that the metaphor you chose ends up guiding how people think about things. And so from the perspective of financial advisors, a really quick example would be like, you could easily say something like budgeting or creating a budget is like dieting, or like a good diet. And that's an okay metaphor, but that might create an aversion for some people. Some people haven't had good experience with dieting. It seems like you are denying yourself something, right? Whereas if I could take the same exact thing and say, hey, listen, budgeting is about paying your future self, right? All of a sudden, it's no longer a loss. It's no longer something I'm denying myself. I'm actually helping my future self, right? And so something as simple as taking stock of what metaphors am I using to couch these conversations? Because ultimately, the metaphor I choose is the metaphor that's going to influence how they think about this topic.
That's great advice, Tat, and great examples. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Listen, this has been a very fascinating and valuable discussion. I think you really did help translate some of the key elements that financial advisors struggle with some very helpful and actionable ideas. So thank you. If listeners want to learn more about you and your company Influence 51, or how your work in behavioral science impacts their world, where should they go?
Yeah, best place would be the website. So if you go to Influence 51, that's influence51.com. There's a lot of information on there, ways to get in contact with me, ways to stay involved in the community, whether it be through the newsletter. And I typically, in the past, I've only worked with companies. I've only really done If a large company brings me in, they want me to work with their advisors. But I'm actually starting something quite new, Sam, over the next few weeks where I'm going to be doing more one-on-one training for individuals. I want to be able to work with individuals one-on-one without them needing their company to hire me. And so if there are financial advisors who find this stuff interesting, who want to understand how they can apply it more specifically to what they're doing, reach out to have a conversation. Would love to teach you anything I can.
That's awesome. Tat, thank you for joining us today on the Future Ready Advisor.
Thank you, Sam, for having me. I really.
In this episode of the Future Ready Advisor, I spoke with JonRobert Tat Tartaglione, a behavioral scientist and the founder of Influence 51, about translating complex psychological insights into practical tools for financial advisors. Here are my 3 key takeaways. Number 1, the power of choice architecture. How you present options dramatically influences client decisions, regardless of the options themselves. Tat highlighted that seemingly minor presentation changes, like the order of investment choices, what you compare them to, or even the time of day they're presented, can significantly impact client preferences and actions. Financial advisors who strategically design their recommendation frameworks can help clients make better decisions while still preserving their autonomy. Number 2, loss aversion as a communication tool. People feel losses roughly twice as intensely as equivalent gains, making this bias crucial for advisors to address. Rather than fighting against loss aversion, Tat suggests leveraging it, reframing spending as investing in your future self, or emphasizing what clients stand to lose by not taking action. This simple shift in messaging can transform resistance into motivation and help clients overcome inaction or on important financial decisions. Number 3, the language revolution. The specific words and metaphors we use shape how clients conceptualize financial concepts. As Tat illustrated, seemingly identical phrases like 80% fat-free versus 20% fat, or annual fundraiser versus once-a-year fundraiser, trigger different psychological responses. Financial advisors can dramatically improve client outcomes by deliberately choosing metaphors that reframe budgeting from dieting, restriction, to paying your future self, investment, making financial discipline feel like an opportunity rather than a sacrifice. Tat reminds us that understanding human psychology isn't just academic. It's the difference between advice that sits unused and guidance that inspires real behavioral change. The most successful advisors aren't just financial experts. They're skilled translators of human behavior. I have some exciting news. After almost 60 episodes exploring how advisors navigate industry disruption, I'm expanding our focus to tackle the universal leadership challenge that connects us all: mastering the tension between hesitation and haste when outcomes are unpredictable. Starting in January, the Uncertainty Edge brings you the same frameworks you value, now enriched with insights from exceptional leaders across all fields who've turned chaos into clarity when everything was on the line. Same value, broader perspective, deeper impact for financial advisors and executives alike. You've been listening to the Future Ready Advisor. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, or share your feedback wherever you listen. Be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. For more insights on how to keep your practice future ready, visit www.samsivarajan.com. You can find the link on the show notes. There you'll find free tools and resources, along with exclusive bonus content from these podcasts. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to sharing more strategies with you in the next episode.